Kaya. Oh, some people have sat with my Welcome to Countries before. Now, everybody, this is reciprocal, the Kaya part. So Kaya is K-A-Y-A. It means hello. And if someone says Kaya to you, you're going to say, Kaya. I reckon you can actually do that better because it's Friday and it's lunchtime and we're halfway through, well, we're just about at the end of this week. So Kaya. Thank you. I won't get you to repeat any further words. So Kaya Wanyan, Murich Yogas, Murich Blat, Murich Marman, Yanning Jerp and Yang Yak and Nidja. Actually, can I ask first, are there any other Aboriginal people in the room? Any hands up? None. Oh, we'll discuss that later. So Nunik Nalang Wonkaning, Nyang Mort Wajak Buja, Nyalang Borlu Buja. Noniga Nyining Yan Nija Buja, Yan Mort Buja. Were Nalang Kora Mort, Nija Wajak Buja. So again, hello and welcome on behalf of the traditional owners of Wajak country. I am a descendant and a bloodline, I have a strong bloodline link going back many thousands of years on Wajak country. I actually come from a family of very outspoken vocal people, but people that actually stand up for the rights of our people on country. And of course, delivering a welcome to country, how many of you have actually gone through cultural awareness programs? Brilliant. So you all understand the significance and the relevance of a welcome to country? So understanding that it's really the first right of respect, that when you're on someone else's country, you acknowledge the First Peoples and the traditional owners and their ongoing roles and responsibilities. And in Reflect, we also then welcome you to country and offer you the protection in a spiritual sense while you're on our country. So for those that have gone through cultural awareness, which was just about every one of you, how many Aboriginal countries are there in Australia? Pretty close. Actually, the jury's still out because of some of the impacts of settlement at the time nationally. We actually don't have a true sense of how many Aboriginal countries there are across Australia. But at the moment, there sits about 375. So how many dialects are there? 600. Over 600 Aboriginal dialects. So when we look at any industry and any project that we're working on, regardless of where that project is, it's really important for you to understand the diversity of those people that actually live in that area of our country and what is the fundamentals and what are the principles and what are the key focus areas that they're driving or are really important to all of our people across country. And of course, one of the pivotal key focus areas is most definitely housing. One of the biggest topics that we discuss in all our native title groups and all our Aboriginal corporations is our social housing issues that are really at the heart of trying to drive our people forward to improve their health, to improve employment, to improve education and to improve business outcomes. So if we don't have capital wealth to draw on, which Aboriginal people don't, we don't have inherited capital wealth. So when we talk about affordable housing projects, that's one of the big topical questions that I get involved in regularly as to how do we make affording and living in a house within the capacity of an Aboriginal person, regardless of where they live and regardless of what their needs are, and I'm talking about family numbers. Some of the basic things, of course, besides Welcome to Countries being a significant protocol and probably the most important protocol when you're in Aboriginal community and dealing with Aboriginal people, please show the respect that everybody deserves. Be treated the way you would like to be treated in your home, because when you're on Aboriginal country, you are in the home, or you're on the home of Aboriginal people and quite a number of Aboriginal people from that area. It is probably one of the biggest and significant issues that you'll deal with in your first point of contact is understanding the relevance and the significance of people, landscape, and then the spirit of country as well, which all three of them go hand in hand. It is the trilogy. So I'll just leave you with some closing words before I exit the stage. So capacity and strength of Aboriginal people is only just being harnessed. Oh, there's a penalty for that, Louise. Is only just being harnessed and identified by professionals as a valuable tool in addressing the inequities or in reorientating our thinking even further to promote equity. Aboriginal people, my people, we have emotional strength, we have spirit. We are the essence of people who have strived and struggled to maintain our strong identities while we are adapting in a very new and challenging world. While we value and pass on our distinctive cultural beliefs, practices and our lifeways, we need to continue valuing our cultural heritage and the protocols we stand by, rather than seeing them as static and idealised. Rather than just focusing on the numerous impacts and damages of instinctive colonisation or the numerous issues today affecting our Aboriginal people, we need to consider culturally innovative, creative and resourceful ways in which Aboriginal people, and they're my people, continue to be recognised and respected as the First Peoples. Understand how we continue our ongoing roles and responsibilities while we are, again, evolving in this very rapidly changing world. So in the housing industry and organisations, please continue to consider what makes our country, our people and our diverse landscape great. Discover what my people have known and understood for many thousands of years, and continue to embrace heritage, our cultural heritage, which is truly unique to our country, and work with us to continue to promote self-reliance and capacity. As need I say, that real achievements may be seen when programs and activities operate with us and not on behalf of us. Please, the number one protocol in all engagement and participation strategies is to engage with Aboriginal people. RAPs, reconciliation action plans, about how to improve your engagement approach and strategy and the objectives that you're going to achieve. So please don't forget those within the activities of all of your projects. And in considering, housing affordability, really topical. Thank you. Border one.
Thank you very much, Karen Jacobs, for that welcome to country. Well, I'm Nadia Mitsopoulos, very pleased and delighted to be your MC for today and be back with my good friends at the BCEC. Now, this is the 17th report in the Focus on WA series, and talk about a hot topic and talk about timing. We'll talk more about what is in this report in a moment, but I would like to take the time to welcome our special guests here today. Jessica Shaw, MLA, member for Swan Hills, Meredith Hammett, MLA, member for Mirrabooka, senior leaders from Bankwest and Curtin University, and also to those leaders from the business community that are here, and also our not-for-profit and community services sector. Welcome to you as well. It is also fantastic to have students here from Morley Senior High School. And I'm sure you are sitting here today thinking, how on earth am I going to get into the housing market? And maybe, you know what, hanging at home with the parents for a little bit longer might not be such a bad thing after all. Now, this report is called Housing Affordability in Western Australia 2023, Building for the Future. And as I mentioned, this could not have been timed any better. Housing affordability, an overheated construction market and a lack of housing supply is dominating the national conversation, and I'm sure you'd agree, creating quite a few headaches for our political leaders as well. Now, I have been looking for some good news in this report. Al and I have tried really hard. I can't find a lot, I'm sorry to say. But what it does show is that housing affordability continues to deteriorate, and there really is no short-term end in sight. We don't have enough homes. They're taking a long time to build. They're expensive, and an increasing number of mortgage holders are starting to now miss repayments. This report also gives us a very valuable insight into where we sit compared to other states when it comes to housing affordability for both homeowners and also for renters, and we certainly won't be forgetting about them today. It looks at the challenges faced by tenants in private rentals, the impact of those interest rate rises on mortgage payments, and the construction delays which are causing labour and material shortages as well, and the list goes on. Crucially though, and importantly, this report does identify key priorities and recommendations, some ways ways that the government could address this issue. You will get a detailed rundown of the report from Professor Alan Duncan, the Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and also from Professor Stephen Rowley, Director of Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute at the Curtin Research Cluster. And then after that, we're going to have a panel discussion. I expect it's going to be pretty robust with a good range of views. On our panel today, Leon McIvor, Deputy Director General of Housing and Assets at the Department of Communities. I did tell him, we know you're not the minister. You can only get the money that you're given to do with it what you can. But I'm sure you've got plenty of questions to ask. Natalie Sangalli, she's the General Manager of Housing Choices WA. Chris Smith, CEO of Foundation Housing, and Tanya Steinbeck, CEO of the Urban Development Institute of Australia here in WA. Now, we would love you to get involved as well. We would like you to submit questions to our panel today. All you need to go is go to www.slido, as in SLI.do. I know a lot of you would be familiar with Slido, so we'd love you to submit some questions. Enter the code #HousingWA2023. So www.sly.do, #HousingWA2023. Submit those questions and we'll get to as many as we can. Now, we do need you to turn your mobile phones on silent, but we would love you to tweet, because we love Twitter. @Bankwest Curtin is the handle, #HousingWA2023. I usually tell you to tweet me in, but I've been hacked and currently living in Oman. So unfortunately, I'm taking a break from Twitter, hoping Elon Musk can help me get back on it. Now, a little bit more housekeeping. The usual rules: keep your distance, keep up the hygiene. You know the drill. If you're feeling unwell, if you need our assistance, come and see us. We'll help you. We'll excuse you. You can go home. As I mentioned, please switch your mobile phone to silent. You don't have to turn it off, because we'd love you to keep the conversation going on social media. If there is an emergency, which is highly unlikely, you'll get the two-tone alarm system, a beep beep, then go and find your closest fire exit, which is pretty much those two over there. Then there'll be the whoop whoop sound. Just pick up the pace a little bit. And that will be your cue to evacuate and just leave everything behind. We'll sort it out later. I'd now like to invite to the stage Peter Bouhlas, the General Manager Home Buying at Bankwest, to welcome you. Please make him welcome.
Thanks, Nadia. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. On behalf of Bankwest, I'd like to officially welcome you all to the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre Housing Affordability Report launch, the latest in the Centre's focus on WA Housing Affordability series. I'm Peter Bouhlas, General Manager of Home Buying at Bankwest, and if you have entrusted us with your home loan, we thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about these important findings. The Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre celebrated its 10th year anniversary last year, and during this time it's grown to become a highly respected and nation-leading research institution, producing social and economic insights that inform and shape the debate on key issues impacting Western Australia and the nation. Bankwest has been part of the fabric of the WA community for more than 127 years, and our support for WA through partnerships that address key social and economic issues impacting customers and the community, including the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, is at the very heart of our culture and DNA. Because our vision is to be a simple, easy bank for the Australian homeowner of today and tomorrow, we're also deeply committed to supporting the housing industry and home buyers in Western Australia. Now, being a proud West Australian, I remind my East Coast colleagues quite frequently that Western Australia is unique in many ways, and this includes our housing market, which comparatively is still very affordable. And we want to help support every West Australian who aspires to own their own piece of the great Australian dream. Now, customer needs are rapidly changing, and so we're evolving with them by transforming our products and services to realise our vision. And as a key step towards this, we recently opened a home buying hub at Bankwest Place in the Perth CBD, the first of its kind in Western Australia, which is it's a dedicated space designed to support current and future home buyers on their journey. We know purchasing a home is possibly the biggest financial decision someone will make, and it's important that we are there every step of the way to help support those customers and guide them through the journey. Bankwest will continue to work closely with industry partners who are here today, such as Keystart, REWA, HIA, Master Builders and the Property Council, to help identify some of the barriers that exist to home ownership. We also know current economic conditions have created challenges for many vulnerable members of our community, who we remain committed to supporting by working with community organisations such as Advocare, the Council on the Ageing and the West Australian Council of Social Services. Because we understand the important role we play as a major West Australian employer and institution in supporting the growth and prosperity of this great state. Now, we're all here today for what is the highly anticipated Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre Housing Affordability in WA report launch, 2 years since the last one. The last report in 2021 was released amidst record low interest rates, with results showing owner-occupiers were in strong financial positions, but it also released in the wake of the lifting of the rental moratorium, which put rapid cost pressures on renters and further tightened the rental market. The report highlighted the significant volume of new build applications that had flooded in because of government stimulus measures, pointing to their potential to ease rental pressures once those builds completed. And here we are today, with a report that is released at a time when our construction market has shown those significant volumes were actually overwhelming volumes, and the state's housing availability, whether owner-occupier or renting, is incredibly limited. From Bankwest data, I can say that at the start of the rate rises nearly 11 months ago, more than 95% of our home loan customers were on average more than 3 years ahead on their mortgage repayments. Consecutive cash rate increases, combined with the inflation and cost of living pressures, have reduced those buffers, but they still remain on average ahead more than 2.5 years, which is reasonably strong. So while we're confident our customers remain financially secure and we have support options for those finding current conditions challenging, both of these indicators do reflect the financial environment is having an impact on people, and households are starting to feel that pinch. However, for the students here with us today, despite the economic headwinds, we also know that millennials and Gen Z, the current and next generation of home buyers, remain committed to the great Australian dream of home ownership. Our Bankwest Home Truths research shows that about 3 in 4 Gen Z and more than half of millennials regard home ownership as important. So one thing that's for certain, no matter what the economic headwinds are, we remain committed to supporting homeowners in any way we can. So I would like to thank the report co-authors, Professor Alan Duncan, Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and Professor Stephen Rowley, Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, Curtin Research Centre, for this very timely and important report. I look forward to hearing the report insights and panel discussion which will follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. We're going to take a break so you can enjoy your lunch, and then in about 20-25 minutes we'll get Alan and Stephen up here and they'll take you through the report. Enjoy. Hello everybody, I hope you are all having a lovely time and enjoying your meal, and thank you again for your attention. Well, let's now go through this report with John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan, the Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and Professor Stephen Rowley, the Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, Curtin Research Cluster. And don't forget, if you would like to submit a question, and thank you for those that already have, you can do so on Slido, and we'll put those to our panel in about 20 minutes.
Thank you, Nadia. We acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the beautiful lands that we're meeting on today, and we pay our respects to elders and knowledge holders past, present and future. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Steve and I will look forward to sharing the main findings from our Housing Affordability Report, the latest in our Focus on WA series. Before we do, we'd like also to thank our co-authors on this report, Ryan Brearty, Alex Buckland and Adam Crow. And we also acknowledge CoreLogic and the Real Estate Institute of Australia for the terrific data that we've been able to draw from for our work. Housing affordability in WA has deteriorated over the past 2 years, as it has for Australia more generally. Property prices have risen strongly, but interest rates have also risen to a degree that inevitably affects housing cost burdens. And the state's rental market presents an ongoing challenge. Rental vacancy rates have plummeted, and this has driven up rental costs to a level that creates genuine hardship for some tenants. So the report that we're launching today looks at the state of WA's housing market with special features on market activity, housing supply and affordability, and we reflect on what might work to improve the state's housing situation. The first thing to say at the outset is that WA is one of the most affordable states in the country for typical properties. The latest CoreLogic Home Value Index for benchmark properties gives a median value of around $575,000 in Perth, and that ranks Perth second lowest on the benchmark property. And the same is true when you look at average sales prices across states and regions. The median house sale in Perth was worth $666,000. That's around 5.7 times median income for Perth residents. And this again ranks us as the second most affordable city behind Darwin. Regional WA is also relatively affordable to the typical resident with a median house price of just under $450,000. But as you know, the RBA's cash rate has increased from 0.1% to 3.85% over the past year, and that's made mortgages progressively more expensive. This table looks at the share of income, the coloured columns, to service a variable mortgage for different home loan rates and repayment terms. The first series compares income shares for a mortgage with a 10% deposit over 30 years, typical for a first home buyer. And the second series looks at mortgages with a 30% deposit over 25 years, more typical for mortgage holders looking to trade up or trade down. The contrast between Perth and the eastern states is pretty clear. For a loan rate of 3.5%, a median family in Perth on a 10% deposit would need to spend 27.9% of their income to afford a median-priced house. That's half the share for Sydney and 50% below Melbourne. But we also see the effects of rate rises on housing cost burdens. For a median home in Perth, an increase in the home loan rate to 6.5% would increase mortgage repayments by over $1,000 a month and lift the share of income to nearly 40%. But this still is far better than other states, even at higher rates. And that's something that's made abundantly clear in this map. You can see here that almost every suburb in Sydney would require the typical family to spend more than a third of their income on mortgage repayments, and substantially more with progressively deeper shades of red indicating higher mortgage shares. Melbourne is expensive in the city and on the Mornington Peninsula, but more reasonable to the west, and Perth is relatively affordable for most suburbs for a typical or median family. But housing affordability is far worse for lower income families. Just focus on this map. Are you watching? This is what affordability looks like for families in the bottom 25% of incomes. A sea of red in Sydney, also a reasonably large sea of red in Melbourne. Income shares are generally above 30% for most areas of Greater Perth, higher, of course, in the CBD and along the coast from Claremont down to Fremantle. Not anything like the East Coast, but still a greater cost burden than the earlier map. And this is why we need to get underneath broad aggregate measures to gain a better understanding of people in different housing situations. But our concern is that affordability is likely to get worse for some homeowners. The RBA's own data provide compelling grounds for these concerns. This chart shows the RBA cash rate since 2019, along with average loan rates for existing fixed-rate mortgages in maroon, new fixed-rate loans in orange, and variable-rate loans in blue. Now, existing loans average around 2.5%, but look at the rate for new fixed-rate loans. If you have to switch from a fixed-term mortgage to a new product in 2023, your rate will pretty much double, and this will increase mortgage repayments by as much as $1,000 per month for someone on a $600,000 loan. And the RBA cash rate rises are starting to take their toll on mortgage holders, particularly new or younger borrowers. Moody's capture mortgage delinquency as a share of the current balance of residential mortgage-backed securities, so-called RMBS, split by the number of months since the loan was taken out and the year the loan was taken out, what we call the loan vintage. Now, for most loan vintages, as you can see here, delinquency rates are around 0.4% for the first 12 months, 0.8% after 2 years, and under 1% after 3 years. But just look at the latest data. We see mortgage delinquency rates for 2022 vintage loans hitting 1.2% after a year. That's more than triple the rate compared to earlier loan vintages. Arrears look to be kicking in at between 6 and 9 months after the loan was taken out, and this aligns with information kindly shared by Keystart, who also find an uptick in loan arrears at around 5 months into the loan, and certainly after the current rate rise cycle. And we've also seen a shift in the mix of mortgages by provider. More than half of all mortgage lending is provided by Australia's major banks in orange, and around a quarter from regional authorised deposit-taking institutions, or ADIs, in blue. But interestingly, non-ADI lenders accounted for around 1.9% of the total lending value in 2020, but that share has more than tripled to 5.9% by 2022. So this suggests to us that the source of loan products is changing for some, more amongst younger or newer borrowers looking for alternative loan products. With this in mind, for us it's imperative that new borrowers are educated in financial literacy and supported in the disciplines required to service their mortgage payments. And that's particularly the case for those who have committed to home ownership for the first time and who have never previously experienced a period of rising interest rates. So over to Steve now to look at WA's housing supply. Steve.
Thanks, Alan. It's certainly been a strange couple of years for housing and the housing industry. I think never has a period of such strong activity been combined with such uncertainty. But let's start with some positives. There we go. As we can see in this chart, rates of home ownership in Perth are higher than any other capital city at 73%, according to the 2021 census. There's a bit of work to do to boost home ownership rates in regional Western Australia. Survey evidence suggests that renters still aspire to home ownership. However, getting there is becoming increasingly difficult. Unlike most other states, in the last 10 years, ownership rates in Western Australia have actually increased, only slightly, but relative affordability and the support for first home buyers are key drivers of this trend. In Greater Perth, ownership increased by about 0.5%, while rental sector contracted slightly. Compare this to a 4.8% fall in the proportion of homeowners in Sydney and 3% in Melbourne. Encouragingly, ownership rates increased in regional Western Australia, as they did in most other parts of regional Australia. The strength of home ownership in Western Australia is reflected in the demand for established dwellings. The graph here shows how sales volumes shot up by 16% in Greater Perth and 30% in regional WA, triggered by COVID as people decided to purchase their first home or trade up. COVID certainly brought forward many purchasing decisions. Sales volumes doubled once stimulus grants were in place in both Greater Perth and regional Western Australia. But due to the lack of listings for sale, days on the market plummeted down to a third of pre-pandemic levels in Perth as homes sold very quickly. This means the level of new stock had no time to build, and particularly or partially explains why there's a shortage of listings available to buy in the current market. A shortage of choice means households are reluctant to sell, and you get a vicious circle which is difficult to break. Switching from established to new supply, we have a lot of new housing stock coming into the system over the coming months, although mostly separate houses in outer areas. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a massive surge in dwellings under construction resulting from the COVID-19 stimulus package. With delays in completion due to labour and material shortage and increasing costs, have resulted in a much larger than normal lag between dwelling commencements and dwelling completions. But hopefully, we'll see a big surge in completions in the remainder of 2023. These completions should result in some tenants exiting the rental market and moving into their new dwellings, but the recent contraction in rental supply caused by around about 19,000 landlords exiting investment means WA vacancy rates are likely to remain low. Approvals almost reached the record set in 2014-15. The difference this time is the lack of multi-residential supply, which will impact on housing choice moving forward. This slide identifies the problem with worker shortages, and this explains the increasing lag between commencements and completions. We see in the table how the key finishing trades such as plasterers, carpenters, wall and floor tilers, so highlighted there, are in short supply with a decline in the number of workers in the last 5 years and a big growth in the number of internet vacancies. It's encouraging to see government and industry working together on initiatives to actually try and improve this capacity. Digging deeper into the building approval data confirms the worrying lack of supply outside separate houses and how new supply will contract over the coming couple of years unless we get another market shock. The annual figures shown here smooth out the 3-month rush in approvals saw in the previous chart. What's evidence from the comparison shown here with New South Wales on the right-hand side is the lack of housing diversity delivered since 2018. The capacity contraction since 2015 is one reason why dwellings are taking so long to complete, and the industry lost a lot of its capacity during that 5-year period and has struggled to attract workers ever since. So I'll pass back to you, Alan, and you can talk about rental costs in Western Australia.
Thanks, Steve. So WA's rental market has presented an ongoing challenge for some time. Median rents in Perth are now $577 a week for houses and $520 a week for a 3-bedroomed house. This is an increase of nearly $150 since March of 2020. And the story is substantially the same for units. The lack of available rental stock and high rental costs create genuine hardship for tenants, but also risk the state's response to skill shortages and its return to consistent population growth and its ongoing economic prosperity. And as Steve mentioned earlier, the financial incentives introduced through COVID for new home purchases haven't yet led to an increase in the supply of homes. And housing investors look to be holding back. We've seen home loans to property investors down 15% over the past year in WA, and down by 1/3 in Australia because of rising interest rates, high cost of living, and concerns about the global economy and tenancy law reform. And we're seeing the same patterns in regional centres as well, with rising rental costs across the board. But the situation is especially acute in certain regions of WA, particularly in the tourism centres in Broome and Busselton, and in the mining regions of Port Hedland, Karratha, and Kalgoorlie. And the rising rents in regional areas have been driven to a large extent by a massive drop in available rental stock. Again, in tourism and mining areas for sure, but also in other parts of the state. Look at how much average rental listings have fallen in Bunbury, in maroon here, and Geraldton, in green. And so, with rents rising so strongly in Perth and in regional areas, how much are people having to spend to cover the cost of housing? This map really blows me away, and not in a good way. The map shows the average share of income going towards rents for people on typical or median incomes on the left, and lower income families on the right. Blue shades are for affordable cost shares of 30% or less. Progressively hotter shades of red take you to shares of 50% and above. And so the picture is one of affordable rental costs for typical families on median incomes, but the picture is so different when we look at rental cost burdens for low-income families. Even low-income families who are seeking lower price point rentals within their suburb. You can see that there are very few suburbs across the whole of Perth that are comfortably affordable to lower income families. most have to pay substantially more than 30% of their incomes towards their rental costs. Now, there is a clear and leading relationship between vacancy rates and rental costs. You can see in this chart that as rents in orange go up, vacancy rates in blue fall, and the reverse is true. But here's the thing. Suppose we invert the axis for the vacancy rate. Then it's even clearer that vacancies and rents move together. And there's a lag. It generally takes somewhere between 6 and 9 months for rents to fall once the rental market starts to ease. And so what does this mean? Well, even if rental vacancy rates increase tomorrow, we wouldn't see lower rents for at least 9 months. So there's not likely to be much relief for private renters for at least the rest of 2023. And this shows why we need to see immediate action in the federal budget to increase the maximum rate of Commonwealth rent assistance by at least 30%, in my view. This would lessen the financial hardship that so many are now facing from high and rising rental costs, and consideration should also be given to a more structured reform to CRA over the longer term so that it's able to keep pace with the prevailing market conditions. Steve.
Thanks, Alan. So I wanted to share with you analysis of the Australian Housing Conditions Data Infrastructure Survey. It's a real mouthful. It's a survey of 22,500 households funded by the Australian Research Council. It's run out of the University of Adelaide and involves a number of housing researchers across the country, including myself. It's the largest dedicated housing survey in Australia, and it explores issues around affordability, dwelling conditions, and housing aspirations. So, as we've heard from Alan, private renters are struggling to save. And in this chart, we compare the proportion of renters that are able to save or invest after paying their rent. We can compare the condition survey with the last 3 BCEC surveys and see how there was a big drop in affordability from 2021 to 22, and we can expect the proportion of renters unable to save to have risen given the rent increases flagged by Alan. With so many renters struggling financially, financial support, as we saw during COVID-19, would help those in danger of falling into homelessness. And that support is one of the reasons why the 2021 figure is so high. Respondents to the survey were asked how satisfied they were with their dwelling. In this side, we show how dwelling satisfaction is more closely linked to dwelling condition than affordability. On the left-hand side, we can see a third of households that rate their housing as unaffordable are dissatisfied with their dwelling. Well, on the right-hand side, a massive 65% of renters in poor quality housing are dissatisfied with their dwelling. So not enough attention is paid to dwelling conditions, and hopefully this survey will help change that. Dwelling conditions is very important because not only is there a link between conditions and satisfaction, there's also a strong link with health outcomes. This slide shows only 4.4% of households in housing of good or excellent condition reported poor mental health outcomes, but this rises to 17.5% for respondents in poor quality housing. So discussions around Rental Tenancy Act reform must include housing conditions, as these are clearly very important to household well-being. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households, and around 850 renters in the survey, reported poorer housing conditions, with almost 15% rating their housing as poor or worse, double the rate of other households. Given the challenges faced by renters, we asked them about the key issues affecting their housing. As you can see from the table, and this covers all renters in Australia by landlord type, over a third of renters stated they had issues with plumbing, 40% difficulty keeping the dwelling warm or cool, the issues being worse in social housing. Maintenance delays were common, as were issues with pests. The full report contains further details on the experience of renters, but needless to say, when compared to owners who were asked the same questions, outcomes are far worse for renters, and the comparison between owners and renters is a feature of this next slide, which compares the presence of sustainability features within dwellings for both owners and renters in WA. There are some massive differences. Owners benefit from a number of features that reduce running costs as well as benefit the environment. Almost half of owners have solar panels, but they're available for just 12% of tenants. As a state, we need to do much better in providing private and public renters access to initiatives that will reduce running costs and therefore increase housing affordability. Certainly incentives for landlords to provide solar power and hot water systems would be a good start. Moving on to the final issue I cover, and possibly the most important, is homelessness. So the ABS very recently released data on homelessness from the 2021 census. The figures I'm about to share with you may well have got worse in the last 2 years since the census survey. So disturbingly, the number of homeless in WA rose 8% in the last 5 years, with women constituting the vast majority of that rise. At 37 per 10,000, this might be the lowest rate of homelessness in the country, but the rate grew faster than anywhere else in Western Australia. Almost 10,000 are now estimated to be homeless, with a third being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You can see from the graph on the right-hand side, growth in homelessness over the last 50 years has been among the older Western Australian cohort, and the rate for people over 75 has doubled. So Western Australia has by far the highest proportion of homeless living in improvised dwellings or sleeping rough, and this reflects the lack of available affordable rental housing in the state. Encouragingly, we do see evidence of an increase in the capacity of supported accommodation for the homeless, and this must continue along with major increases in funding for both social housing and homelessness services. It's encouraging to see state and indeed federal government investing in what is essential infrastructure, but rather than one-off funding boosts, we need long-term and significant spending commitments. So finally, I just wanted to highlight a few points. So the points listed on the slide here and will be, I've no doubt, covered in the panel session. But as I've already mentioned, we need a significant increase in funding for the homelessness sector and for housing first initiatives that have been proven to deliver quality outcomes for homeless people. The sector is under tremendous pressure with ever-increasing cries for help and is buckling under the strain. I believe government recognises this, but certain long-term funding is required to support many small organisations that are doing a tremendous job. Add to that, long-term sustained funding is relevant to the second point too. In order to keep the level of social housing just at its current proportion, which is unfortunately below 4%, we need to deliver at least 900 social housing dwellings every year. Not one-off funding boosts, but consistent annual funding providing some certainty to the sector. Given the upcoming contraction in housing supply, government should accelerate its social housing building program to take advantage of the easing capacity in the industry, particularly in the starting trades. Government has done really well to deliver over 1,000 new social housing dwellings in a constrained market, but now is the time to accelerate that program. During the pandemic, stimulus measures were necessary to prevent job losses in the construction industry, and government couldn't predict at the time how costs would play havoc with the industry. These costs are having a massive impact on the ability of the private sector to deliver multi-residential developments. Again, it's encouraging to see government listening to industry and trying to address cost issues by providing funding to address infrastructure barriers. And this direct supply-side support is essential. And I think a review of current policy settings that affect multi-residential investment are also required. The report clearly highlights the plight of the renter. Rents are rising rapidly, tenants are desperately clinging onto their rentals, and there's nowhere else to go. Residential tenancy reform to deliver greater security of tenure, better housing conditions, and generally to improve the life of renters is long overdue. However, we cannot forget that private rental supply relies on small investors. We need reform that balances the needs of tenants with the objective of landlords. I would argue in a time where supply is so tight, we need to be careful about introducing reforms that might have a negative impact on supply, leaving many renters worse off. Federal and state governments have recently announced various incentives for build-to-rent investors. While build-to-rent is certainly no silver bullet in the quest for more affordable housing, it will increase supply in the private rental sector. I'd like to see further incentives linked to the provision of affordable housing within build-to-rent developments, ideally working in partnership with the community housing sector. I think the community housing sector has a critical role to play in increasing the supply of social housing going forward. Finally, I believe there's a major role for the private sector in delivering affordable housing products as part of private market developments. Affordable housing products such as below-market rental housing for key workers are rare and could be integrated with market developments with appropriate policy and support. I look forward to the day when large-scale provision of affordable housing is a normal part of private sector development. So it's always good to finish on a controversial note, so I thank you for your time.
Nothing wrong with a bit of controversy. That's what we like in the media. Thank you to Professor Alan Duncan and also to Professor Stephen Rowley, who's going to stay on stage for our panel discussion. I'm going to get the panel up. In the meantime, please use Slido if you would like to submit a question. And remember, the event code is #HousingWA2023. Please welcome to the stage Leon McIvor, Deputy Director General Housing and Assets at the Department of Communities, Natalie Sangalli, General Manager Housing Choices WA, Chris Smith, the CEO of Foundation Housing, and Tanya Steinbeck, CEO Urban Development Institute of Australia here in WA. I'm going to head on over. You all hear me? Ah, there we go. Oh, it's quite nice to sit down. Okay, as I said, we'll get to your questions in a moment. Look, Leon, I might just start with you because I'm sure you are itching to tell us about how the government is addressing this issue of housing shortages.
Thanks very much, Nadia, and thanks for this opportunity. Look, the government this week has announced a range of things that will come out in the budget, including a $511 million investment in social housing and in homelessness, and a range of programs that we're working through. There are other announcements this week to support the bringing in of workers and construction workers, and as well as funding to support infill infrastructure so that we can get some of that medium density product moving along. That's all part of the government has previously talked about $2.4 billion to deliver 3,300 homes. That's now expanded, and we're going to aim to deliver 4,000 social homes in the coming years. We added about 700 homes to our stock last year. 600 of those were social, and this year we will add 700 social homes to our stock to hit 1,300 over 2 years. Those sort of things, we're doing grants with the sector, and of course, I'm sure we'll talk about later, but we have a range of things to help and work with the sector to increase density and those sorts of things. And of course, I can't forget the homelessness component of this. The Minister for Housing is also the Minister for Homelessness. We have a sector 10-year plan. The sector is supportive of that plan. There are a range of initiatives to increase crisis accommodation. We're buying hotels. We're coming up with any idea we can to support people through that process. And we also have things like the supported landlord model, which we're working on with Housing Choices, to get rough sleepers directly into houses as quick as we can.
Just on that point though, you talk about those 4,000 homes that you're going to deliver, but isn't the challenge, the figure in this report, 900 a year, and that you have to keep sustaining that every year? Is that achievable?
Well, we're tracking towards it, 600, now 7. We're tracking.
But that's got to be long term, doesn't it?
That's right, it does. And look, we still work on 4-year funding envelopes, but that's more than enough time for us to plan ahead. When you look at an asset base the size of ours, I have 50,000 assets that I oversee. You've got to add new stock, but you've got to keep and extend the life of your current stock. We've invested more in refurbishments, and in fact, this budget will do that as well. Every time I secure $1 from the government, I look at new build, buying land, extending the life of the houses we have, and our disposals are at historic lows. We're by extending the life of as many assets as I can, then the houses that are really at that older end, we are disposing of as few as possible.
Natalie, if I can ask you, because you were making the point to me the other day that the cheaper suburbs are no longer cheaper anymore, and also there's a real mismatch in the kind of housing that keeps being built and what's needed.
Thanks, Nadia. And I think at the moment it's really appreciated that the state government is doing all they can in the social housing space. What really worries me now is the avalanche of people who are sitting just above that social housing need, but still in a position where they're under real housing stress, could have previously moved out to more affordable suburbs, but now they're being priced out of those suburbs as well.
And so what sort of suburbs are you talking about?
So I'm talking about your suburbs down towards Mandurah, out around Armidale, Gosnells, Thornley. People could previously have chosen to move out there where it was more affordable, but now they're getting priced out of their own neighbourhoods. For me, there's a glut of people there, and the social impacts of putting those people under that housing stress around their mental health and their health and the educational outcomes for their kids, that's the stuff that's really worrying us at the front line now.
And just on the mismatch, because we have a lot of 2-3 bedroom homes or 4 bedroom homes, we need more 1 and 2 bedroom homes, don't we?
Yeah, so I think the report, I might be saying the numbers wrong, but I think we're building about over 80% of that bigger home on larger blocks. What the joint wait list shows us, the wait list for social housing, is that over 70% of that need is for single and 2-bedroom houses. So we're building big ones and we need smaller ones.
Chris, that leads me to you, and this all then speaks to the lack of secure accommodation, which is very much what you look at.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Look, I just, if we look at the number of available properties for rent in Western Australia at the moment, there's 1,800 properties. 5 years ago, there was 18,000. So, and if we think about some of our most vulnerable tenants, a single mother who's eligible for social housing with 2 dependents, 2 children, she can earn up to $37,800 a year and pay around $10,000 a year in rent. If that single mother was to be on $45,000 a year, she wouldn't be eligible for social housing. And having had a look at the REAL website only this week, which we review routinely, there was 19 properties available for rent between $200 and $300 a week, and it was only 2 that were 2 bedrooms. So there's it's a dire rental situation at the moment for people who are trying to secure properties in Perth and Western Australia at the moment. And I think Steve and Alan touched on it with their presentations about the need to activate supply and the challenges in doing that.
This hasn't happened overnight, though. This is a 40-year problem.
Look, there was a recent report released in January this year through the Productivity Commission on a report on government services that showed a regression in total public housing numbers nationally, so not just in WA but across the country, over a 10-year period. So we have had a gross underinvestment in public housing infrastructure across the country, not just folks in WA. So that is where, with credit to the current federal government introducing the Housing Australia Future Fund, looking to address that with perpetual investment into long-term sustainable social and affordable housing.
Tanya, the big focus now on social housing, but what about affordable housing? Because looking at this report, we have had an over-reliance on the private sector to deliver affordable housing.
Thanks, Nadia. I think it's really important that when we look at housing supply in particular, that we're taking a broader systemic view of housing supply across the entire continuum. When you overinvest in one particular component of housing stock, such as social housing, there's inevitably going to have a flow-on effect to other housing stock within the market. So, for example, very difficult at the moment to build new stock due to construction capacity constraints, and so one of the quickest ways to increase social housing supply is to spot purchase them. And so the state government will spot purchase housing out of the established market, which then reduces the amount of stock from the established market that may have been rented out or owned to increase the supply in another area. And so I think we need to take a long-term systemic view of making sure that there is adequate supply across the continuum, so that when those people have the capacity to be able to transition out of social housing when their circumstances improve, that they are then supported into subsidised private rental or affordable home ownership. There has to be the supply there to be able to accommodate those that need to transition. So it's a very complex situation that we're facing at the moment, and I think we can't just have a narrow focus, although it's extremely important to have the consistent social housing supply. We also need to make sure that there are other products for those that are capable to transition into.
Can I just add there that Tanya's absolutely right. That gap between social housing and the bottom end of the private rental market is big. That's where there's the real shortage in supply. Yes, we need more social housing, but there is nothing that is bridging that gap between social housing and the private rental market, allowing tenants to transition from social housing into other forms. The demise of NRAS, the National Rental Affordability Scheme, which actually delivered some housing, is just another nail in the coffin of the delivery of affordable bottom-end product. And that's, I think, where we need to concentrate, which is why I suggest there is a role for the private sector in delivering that type of product if we can structure some careful policy.
So, well, what should that policy look like? What are you forcing them to, in their development, set aside, I don't know, 5 or 10, jump in anyone, of what they build is affordable. I thought, I mean,
Absolutely.
how would you do that? Because they might argue, well, hang on, we've got to also make a return.
And they will argue that, I can assure you. But it's happening across the country, it's happening in other countries as well. It's about the actual developer having the ability to pass on that cost to the landowner, which means you need a very long lead-in time for the market to adjust. But yes, you have to say, and Development WA are moving down this path, I'm glad to see, that a certain proportion of the market development is affordable, being whatever product that might be. Social housing requires the biggest subsidy, but discounted rental, even shared equity, different products like that, I think would fit into market developments better than social housing. And I think we have to go down that route.
If I can add, and it seems like an odd thing to say in a conversation like this, that affordability is only one part of that solution. I think that the sustainability and the security of tenure is another huge part of the solution, because while we can sit and say it's lovely that people in social housing can move on to the private market, the reality is the insecurity of the private market at the moment means most people who are in social housing will stay there because they know that they can have a house for as long as they need it, as opposed to the private market at the moment where we're sitting on 6-month leases and the fear is that I could be turfed out at any moment. So I think hand in hand, and your other controversial point about looking at the Residential Tenancies Act and whether it's the right time for that, if my time to shine and be controversial, I think it's the right time for that.
Well, I think if you want no grounds eviction, I'm not sure you're going to get it, quite frankly.
If I may.
I'm sorry to say, but it doesn't seem there's an appetite for that in government.
If I may, look, Foundation Housing, we 3 years ago launched Elevate by Foundation Housing, which is an affordable housing product for keen essential workers. So we acquired 110 units for keen essential workers. We had 3,000 people apply for that program. Such was the demand for that level of property. And what we're seeing with our tenants who are coming through that is we're housing nurses who are working close to hospitals, teachers, support workers, but we're providing security of tenure. Rents are capped at a certain price so people don't pay more than 30% of their income. In addition to that, we're also looking at securing a facility to acquire affordable housing units in market-led developments where we're working with developers. So there is a propensity and a willingness to do that, but that will take time. We're relying on developers to get their projects to commencement. And in the current market, we've got one project that we're currently in meaningful dialogue with. The others are finding it really hard due to those construction costs. So the supply that we need is still some many years away from materialising.
Do we need more build to rent?
Yeah, well, if I may, I think build to rent is now becoming a much more viable proposition, given the recent announcements by the federal government around changes to taxation and also our state government's initiatives around land tax and other initiatives that make build to rent more viable. Build to rent at the moment, though, is still a premium product. There's very little affordable build to rent in the market, and it's still relatively new for Western Australia. So I think it's going to take some time for, I guess, the volume of build to rent accommodation to make a meaningful impact to supply. I think we've got a little way to go.
Is that on the? Would you like more?
So we have one particular build to rent project in Smith Street in Highgate. Minister and I were standing at the front steps of that yesterday. NIFIC were in town and we sat with NIFIC and several agencies, the Department of Planning, Land and Heritage, who are here today, Development WA and ourselves went through with NIFIC on a range of land development opportunities that the state's sitting on, that we really want to make sure that ourselves and the community housing sector and NIFIC are lined up in preparation for the Commonwealth Housing Australia Future Fund to be passed. And I know it hasn't passed, but again, the Minister and I were also in Canberra this week at the meeting of all national ministers, and it was very clear that the Commonwealth want to really push that through. It will take time, but that will help us target that exact product that we've all just talked about. That is, it's the one most in need. It's the hardest one to build at the moment.
All right, let's go to a couple of questions. This one, oh, yeah, okay. I get a text about this every day on the program. What role, if any, I'd say a lot, is short-term, like Airbnb rentals, playing in rental supply? So whoever wants to jump in on that, I'd say a fair bit down south.
Yeah, massive implications for certain regional areas, particularly the tourism areas. I'm a strong believer that that sector needs much firmer regulation, particularly when a vacancy rate drops below a certain level. So you could have a policy where if vacancy rates in the local market drop below 2%, it triggers a requirement to bring back certain suitable properties back into the private rental market. So there are a lot of Airbnb.
Is that fair? Because
well, no,
that
it's not
might
fair,
be
but
my
it's not fair to
income.
local people who've got nowhere to live and local businesses who've got no workers.
Oh, just playing devil's advocate here, but how is that fair? Because I might be the mum and dad investor, and Rewa always talks about the mum and dad investor. That might be my income. Now, isn't it my right to be able to do whatever I want with the property that I've invested in?
You'll still be generating an income, but this time in the private rental market, and for 52 weeks a year and not 20 weeks a year.
I think, this is a really interesting conversation, and I met only last week with a senior executive from Expedia who own, the alternative to Airbnb. And the conversation that we had was really fascinating in that the vast majority of stock for short stay accommodation that they have, even if it was to be regulated and restricted and returned to the private market, it's not affordable product. The vast majority of product that, certainly from their perspective, is not going to be a product that will be on the rent, in the private market, something that would be considered affordable for those on low to moderate incomes. So it depends on what form of supply.
Well, no.
So would you would then have to say, okay, vacancy rate hits a certain level, you've got to put it back for a long-term rental. You'd have to then dictate the price.
As I mentioned, suitable accommodation. So Tony's right. There's not a great proportion that is suitable because it would be far too at the top end. But at least there'll be some there that you could actually bring on and add to the private rental market that would be, relatively affordable. But yeah, it's not going to work for everything because you go down to Dunsborough and you pick up a property that you're looking a couple of $1,000s a week. That's not going to help anyone in the private rental market. But there are parts that could work.
Yeah, and an $8 pie. Anyone else want to jump in? Oh, okay. Hello.
A new panel member.
We'll probably have to get a microphone to you. Do we have?
I can speak louder.
Okay, so can you just introduce yourself?
Joe White, President of Rowley, but I'm also a Dunsborough estate agent, which sort of puts me firmly in the bullseye at the moment. I think on the Airbnb one, the point's made. We did see a slight migration towards it when the traffic was constrained in Australia. And that led to a slight move, but it wasn't a large move towards Airbnb. We're now actually seeing in the suburban areas a significant move back. We're seeing the short stay managers say, no, we don't want any more short stay rentals in places like Dunsborough Lakes because the demand for that has simply ebbed away as people have started to travel. But either way, Airbnb has become a bit of an all-purpose evil on this thing. And frankly, it's a very, very small part of the problem. I know in my own agency, we have got far more people permanently living in short stay zone properties than what we do the other side of the equation. I think on that one, to be blunt, I think it's such a small part of the problem. I'd rather concentrate on total housing supply because it's more roofs over more heads, particularly the diversity issues of the 1x1s and the 2x1s and the 2x2s. I think that's a very, very important part of the debate. But I think with the brain capacity in this room to be concentrating on Airbnb, frankly, is not a good use of our time.
It was a genuine question, though. Thank you, Joe. Now, would reducing the current 8% variable interest rate of the Key Start program improve affordability?
Look, Key Start and Key Start are in the room. Key Start have done a brilliant job for more than 20 years. We've helped, I think, more than 8,000 people through a range of those products. Key Start is our transitional lender. It is there. There's some shared equity products where the government will take that part ownership. It's a brilliant way to get people into the market, get them established. Key Start provide absolute support to people to make sure they're structuring their finances right. And our goal, which may seem strange, but our goal of Key Start is to move people through to the more traditional market. And then we will buy back the product that they bought into, and we will recycle it and get it back out there again. So they're filling a critical piece of the puzzle, which is about being a transitional lender for people to get into the market, and we absolutely want them to move their way through the market.
Okay. This one from Jay. playing devil's advocate, do we need to adjust our expectations of our homes to assist with affordability? Kids sharing rooms, lower spec, no home theatres, or 2 lounge rooms?
You're looking at me like you want me to take that one.
Oh, well, anyone can, but maybe we do need to reduce our expectations.
Yeah, look, it was interesting the point made in the document about how WA looks like we're better off than everybody else, which is all good and well when you're comparing to other states, but the essence is that we're still doing really, really badly in WA. I'm not quite sure how that helps the lower end of the market, because in general the very low income people are occupying houses, maxing out their occupancy of houses, particularly in social housing. We have rules around that. In the upper end, potentially.
I think the challenge with the housing stock that we have, which we spoke about briefly before, is the mismatch between housing need and the actual stock that is available. And so there's a high degree of under-occupation in our housing stock, both in the public housing or social housing and in the private market. And so there's a lot of talk around the need for people to be supported in right-sizing as their lifestyle, and needs change over time. And so we've got a lot of single and couples living in 4-bedroom properties when what we really need is the 1 and 2s, which we spoke about before. And the problem with that at the moment is there is very, very little capacity in the construction sector, in the Tier 1, Tier 2 construction sector, to actually build medium to high density housing stock at the moment. So there is basically very, very little in the pipeline for particularly high density product, and I can't see that changing anytime soon until we start to see the constraints on the construction sector and skills shortages and material prices, etc., start to pull back. But I think we're going to be in a bit of trouble for a little while.
Yeah, there are 2 things that drive a purchase decision really: location and affordability. So you can have all the expectations you want, but if you can't afford it, then it's irrelevant. So you buy the best you can with what you can afford. So yeah, households will have to adjust expectations to what they can afford, and it's as simple as that.
Now, I mentioned earlier we have Morley Senior High School, some students from that school here, and I believe Simone has a question. Where are you, Simone? Stand up so we can see you. Hello.
Hello. How are you doing? Simon Martinovsky from Morley Senior High School. And I'll just pop up my question real quick. With the current state of the housing market in Australia, investment appears like a good option for future financial security. So my question is, how I can get into the housing market at a young age in order to take advantage of these investment opportunities? Thank you.
Win lotto?
Yeah. Get a decent job, work hard, and we talked about it earlier, unfortunately have wealthy parents, because that's the way it's going, that you're relying on the bank of mum and dad to help you into home ownership. We do have a range of low deposit home loan products to help, and Keystart is one of them, so there are options there, but really you need help with the deposit. The deposit is the biggest barrier to home ownership, so you need to build up that wealth in order to get yourself into home ownership. And I wouldn't be rushing into home ownership. I'd be going in enjoying yourself first, and then come to Curtin University. Get a good job, and then go and buy your house.
Can I just ask, and anyone else feel free to pick up on it, I would like to ask a follow-up question. Simone, do you still have the microphone? I just have a question, because I just want to pick up on something that Peter Bouhlas said earlier, and I was interested, you were talking about a survey that you had done, Peter, and you were saying that 4 out of 5 young people rated housing ownership, home ownership as important, but I wonder if it's a priority. Is it a priority for you?
Definitely, housing is definitely like a priority in the future. To be honest, I'm gonna be like leaving my parents to get a good job, and finish university. I will be going to Curtin actually. Future physiotherapist right here, so we'll see that. But yeah, I think it's definitely like important to have your own house in the future once you're stable income and everything. And if the time comes, if you have the right funds, like investing in other properties, that's what I want to do in the future as well, just to build wealth.
But it does, that wealth divide is really important. There are groups that don't have that access to capital. They don't have that wealth passed through generations, and we heard earlier, Indigenous households in particular. So the gap just gets wider and wider with the haves and have-nots, and it's a real inequitable system, unfortunately.
Well, Karen Jacobs raised that point. She was saying, obviously some people are lucky that they can have equity or money or a house passed down, but you don't get that in Aboriginal communities at all. So how do you address that?
And I think combine that with the some of it's a luck and a inherited wealth issue, but it's a bit of a luck in timing issue as well. Because I've lived a life of low interest rates and not particularly expensive housing. My kids are now walking straight into a generation of increasing interest rates and really expensive housing. And they're saying to me, this isn't fair. Why are you putting interest rates up at the time when I want to go out and buy a house? So there's that interesting intergenerational fairness around when the Reserve Bank chooses to, or needs to make these decisions.
But those low deposit products do help overcome that gap, do help bridge that lack of deposit. So it's something to look into if you are trying to break into home ownership, look at the options for low deposit products.
I think too in this country we tend to, everybody wants to vie for the great Australian dream of owning their own house, but in a lot of other countries in the rest of the world that's not the case. People are renting for their lifetime.
But is that a bad thing?
Well, no, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think then it leads back to the philosophical conversation around how generally in Australia we view housing as a wealth creation tool rather than a fundamental human need and right. And so until you sort of come to grips with how you want to view housing, that is going to continue to influence how housing is made available to the broader community. You can't have it both ways. And I think at the moment, it's very much an asset. People want to build their own personal wealth and asset base using housing, and that has consequences, as does, the alternative.
I think also, Nadia, that going to the point of renting is there's the uncertainty of renting, the uncertainty of knowing whether you'll be in that house for 6 months or 12 months or 2 years, the uncertainty about what you'll be paying in rent. If you are forced to move, what are the costs of relocating and the ongoing disruption to the family? So I think that's where until we refine some of those renting parameters in the RTA, there'll always be aspirations for home ownership so people can provide that certainty to their families and their future generations.
Now, here's a good question that relates to that. Why do we only have 6 and 12-month leases? Why can't we have 5-year leases?
You can.
You can?
Yeah.
Who gives a 5-year lease?
Well, if you negotiate with the landlord of the property, man, there's nothing stopping you in the Act to have longer leases. It's just we have prescribed 6 and 12-month contracts.
Would a landlord do that? No, realistically they would.
But the landlord could do that.
So, and some of I think some of the cause behind that is that the mum and dad investors aren't investing and owning properties at a scale where they can take that risk. Whereas your more institutional investors in other countries where you've got a big scale, you can spread your risk, you can offer, like community housing providers do, that security of tenure. Personally, I think that's part of the answer, is moving towards that diversified risk and security of tenure for people so that they can think that renting a house for the whole life is quite normal and not a second-rate citizen.
Another question. If housing is a core need identified in Maslow's hierarchy, okay, I'm not going to pretend I know what that is, I'm sorry. Why so many taxes, levies and duties?
Okay, so I think successive governments at all levels have had their foot on the hose of housing supply for a very long time. And whether or not that is through regulation, policy settings, planning approvals, or taxation such as stamp duty or foreign buyer surcharge, all of those things have a cumulative impact on the ability of the private sector to be able to bring supply to the market in an appropriate time frame. And it's not just one setting here and one setting there, and these sorts of decisions are generally made in isolation of each other. It's the cumulative impact of policy, regulation and taxation that makes housing very expensive to be able to deliver across all sectors.
I don't think you'll find too many people in this room, unless there's someone from Treasury who supports stamp duty. It's just a crazy tax we've got so few listings here. If you remove stamp duty tomorrow, suddenly people would start moving. It would increase household mobility dramatically.
Well, stamp duty is only there as a revenue stream.
Absolutely.
So if you take stamp duty away, and I appreciate New South Wales is looking, well, Dominic Perrottet was looking at giving you an option. ACT is transitioning out of it over 20 years. How do you replace that then? Like, who do they take from?
I'm sure the Treasury person in the room would tell you that it's paying for your visit to the emergency department. So.
Yeah, so I think there is an answer to that. I think there's been, I don't know how many papers and research and evidence to support that there is an alternative to stamp duty. I think broadly speaking, it is a broad-based land tax. That the issue is that we operate on a 4-year election cycle. Mm-hmm. So decisions to substantially change stamp duty, which does bring in a significant amount of revenue, it's a risk. It's a political risk, and we are yet to see a government that has been bold and courageous enough to make that choice. So until we start to make the systemic changes that are required to change how we supply housing in this country, I don't think that we're going to see long-term affordability come down.
And there's possibly an opportunity here in WA that's as rare as any, where we've got a government who may be in charge for a bit longer yet to make those big, brave decisions. I think the other thing, the big takeaway from me out of this report was the need for governments to be brave about levelling out the peaks and troughs of the housing sector and to start to build social infrastructure in those troughs when it's cheaper and the labour needs propping up, rather than waiting until we hit a boom and going, oh shit, we haven't got enough houses again.
So build in the busts.
Build in the bust. Have the political will to build in the bust.
Oh, look at this. We've got, yes, get a microphone over to Eric Ripper, the former Treasurer. Nice to see you. Do we have a mic? How are you, Eric? Stand up and we'll get a microphone to you because you need to be heard. I do remember when, we get the mic, when Eric Ripper was delivering his supercharged, it was a supercharged budget, then it was a V8 supercharged budget, and then it was a turbo budget, and you hung on to all the money, didn't you?
Look, this stamp duty argument is really part of a more general problem, and that is most of the policies that would make housing more affordable are in fact politically unpopular. The stamp duty abolition would make more efficient use of our housing stock because people would be not so inhibited in changing houses and downsizing and so on. But that stream of revenue, if we want to fund hospitals, has to be replaced. The ideal replacement is a land tax, but that would mean that every homeowner here would face an additional rates bill, and those people that have paid stamp duty 30 years ago and have forgotten all about it and stayed in their house in Dalkeith for that period of time might be very surprised at the substantial land tax bill that they would have to pay. I think it's a good reform, but there's that problem, and the second problem is that it would reduce initially the revenue available to government, and that would have to be funded either by the federal government coming in and supporting reform or by borrowing a lot of money with the expectation of eventually paying it back. But it's only one of many problems where we face the conundrum that to improve housing affordability, we really should reduce the price of houses, and people don't tend to support that.
Thank you, Eric. Or you could revisit the premium property tax. Remember that? Or have you?
Well, yes, it was a land tax that was only going to apply to 900 houses, and all hell broke loose, including from the media, and people in Cunnanoppin thought that they were going to be paying the premium property tax. And so when Jeff Gallup and I did the polling, 1/3 of people supported it and 2/3 opposed it. And so we abandoned it. So if you can't put a land tax on the 900 most expensive properties in Perth, how can you put it on everyone?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Good to see you. Another question on Slido. Construction cost increases mean that the prices for land, houses and apartments need to go up to increase supply. So how do we improve affordability given this?
Well, I think it's very difficult because I think in reality we've been very fortunate in WA to maintain, I guess, the mantle of being one of the most affordable cities in this country. But the reality is, if you look at house prices, we've been relatively stable over a period where there is no shortage of demand and constricted supply. We've not yet seen real significant price pressure particularly on established houses, but that's not sustainable when you've got such significant levels of demand and such little supply. It's going to have increased pressure on pricing, which we're starting to see in the rental sector. We haven't yet really seen to a large degree in the established market yet. But even new land sales, as a proportion of the house and land package, have remained relatively flat over the last 3 years. The cost escalation has been in the construction component. So until we start to see skills shortages issues resolve and material supply issues resolve, then I think it's going to be very tricky.
The government's announced its housing diversity pipeline, where we focus on bringing land at no cost, and we will often put a significant capital contribution in return for getting some social housing on those sites, but with a very strong focus then on the remainder of that product being affordable housing or market, and partnering with the community sector and through NIFIC as a financer. And these things aren't quick, but there's an absolute commitment to keep looking at that land that's available and bring it to market. And certainly it's essentially available at no cost, and then we will provide a capital injection to support the social component at a minimum.
It's a good question, Nadia. I think for market-led product, it's going to be a real challenge to see market apartments come to be constructed over the next few years. I mean, I think we're seeing the higher end product slightly starting to stack, and we're working with a few developers on some of their projects on taking out their affordable stock. But a lot of the projects we've been working with, the developers just can't make the projects work because of the construction costs. And that's going to be the challenge. And I think the affordable piece can work because we're receiving subsidies, whether it be through the state or the federal government. So the push to proceed to make sure we have affordable housing and social housing in the market over the next few years is there, but it's requiring significant government subsidies to make it work. I don't think the private developers are going to receive those subsidies, so that'll mean the market stock will be some time before we see that less than higher premium stock in the market.
Isn't that the problem for developers? Because they're saying, well, yeah, we'd love to build our high rises and our apartments in the outer suburbs, but they won't make money on it. So it's not worth it.
No, they don't financially stack.
It becomes a waiting game. You have to wait from a developer's perspective for prices to go up high enough to generate the revenue that makes it affordable. So the problem is
so then they build in the boom.
There'll be no new supply, so prices will go up, and then eventually it will become profitable, and then it will kick off. But who knows how long that's actually going to take.
Okay, here's another question. How are the housing shortages impacting areas of labour skills shortages in regional areas? And are there any initiatives or strategies in place to offset these or ease them? Anyone know?
Well, I can only reflect on some conversations that I've had, with my industry colleagues from HIA as an example, and some of our members who are home builders, that those that have a presence, particularly in the southwest, and you've mentioned some of the other examples up north. It's a significant issue. The trade issue that we have in the metropolitan area is nothing in comparison to trying to attract the trade base in regional locations. It is incredibly difficult. So I guess the challenge around the extended construction timeframes for a standard house now having blown out significantly, it is even more acute in regional locations.
This is Louise Gillito from WACOS. How many Aboriginal organisations are social housing providers, and what is state government doing to improve and support Aboriginal housing providers? Good question.
So there's currently no registered community housing organisation that is also an Aboriginal controlled organisation. We've funded Shelter WA so that we can work with them to do more to take some of those Aboriginal controlled organisations through the journey to become registered. There are many, many Aboriginal organisations that are actively involved in housing. Some of our native title transfers include a substantial amount of housing and capital injection for that housing. And the government has a $200 million Northwest Aboriginal Housing Fund with an absolute focus on delivering housing, but that it is transferred to Aboriginal people for ownership and Aboriginal corporations to manage that housing into the future.
Okay, thank you for that. Just on that point too, I'm just trying to find the question because it did refer to regional housing. I'll try and find it, but this one's come through. The government has a great focus on social housing, but is there enough focus on improving affordability across the housing continuum? I think we've kind of covered that quite extensively, unless anyone else has anything else to add on that one. Now, excuse my ignorance, I don't know what GROH stands for.
Government regional.
Okay, so why can't government regional housing in regional areas be shared across agencies to avoid houses being vacant if not being used by individual agencies? Does that happen now?
So look, I manage the government worker housing, which we do call the GROW program. There's about 5,000 properties around WA. All sorts of client agencies, from teachers to police to corrections officers and child protection workers, use it. What we do structurally is we lease that to one of those agencies, like education. They'll place their teacher in it. Some of those teachers will share that accommodation. At times, there's vacancies across that stock, but often actually, given it's basically for employees, it's people cycling out, it's people taking a period of extended leave and that sort of thing. Certainly with the Minister, we've looked in detail at the vacancies and been very clear with agencies that the time is there now that if you are underutilising that stock, we'll take it back to give to another agency in more need.
And you've started doing that?
Yes, that's right.
Do you know how many you've had to?
I don't have that number, but we do. It's across Western Australia. It's a critical piece of housing to support having government workers like essential services in those towns. So we're pretty red hot on trying to make sure it's as available as possible.
Professor, I've got another one here from Professor Fiona McKenzie. Housing in rural, regional and remote communities is an unprecedented crisis. Could the reinstatement of government employee housing fund make a difference?
Look, I know that when it comes to remote housing, the government's announced $300 million for a mix of improving the utilities in remote communities and to increase the housing. And we've seen through things like the flooding in the Fitzroy Valley just how devastating it can be to both Aboriginal people but also anyone who has housing in these remote locations with those weather events coming through. So there is a fund there that's looking to improve that. I think I know across government there's also working through the Housing Australia Future Fund, the Commonwealth's plan. There's been a lot put up to the Commonwealth about how do they come along and help us do more in remote communities as well.
What about shared equity scheme? This is a question from David. He's saying it helped deliver a pathway to home ownership and the program's now been scrapped. Do we need to bring it back?
Sorry, for remote Aboriginal housing or for in general? In general. So
I
we
think.
Still have a shared equity scheme, of which, as I said before, essentially we will underwrite the property, working with Key Start. People can essentially buy in to a proportion of that property, and when they're ready to move through, we will guarantee and purchase it back. And that helps people move their way along the housing continuum.
I think, sorry, just to add to that as a sort of reference before, is because we are at the moment very clearly focused on increasing social housing supply, and it's difficult to build them at the moment. The reallocation of stock that would have been otherwise available to shared equity or other forms of product have also been reallocated to social housing, and it's not in massive volumes, but because we're still trying to, rob Peter to pay Paul, there's less in market for that type of product.
And it's got a lot of potential, always has done, and it's been quite successful in Western Australia and South Australia, and very successful in the UK over a period of time. And it really does provide another opportunity to get into that housing market. But I think we're seeing the current government's attempt to introduce their own shared equity program, federal government. So I think it's got a lot of potential moving forward, and I think we will see it grow.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. I really want to raise this one because it's been a hot topic of conversation and we are waiting to hear what the government is going to do, but it's regarding the review into the Residential Tenancy Act. And is it really at risk of scaring off mum and dad investors from residential investment? Now, REWA, sorry Joe, will argue that it will and that all of these mum and dad investors will start offloading their rentals.
So there has been some research published by Ahuri that was based in on the East Coast, and they did look at rental tenancy reform in the past to see whether it had any impact on rental availability, and the answer was no, it didn't. So there is evidence there, but I know that there will be lots of arguments to the contrary. And as I said in the presentation, I don't think we can risk a reduction in supply at this time. We've got a vacancy rate below 1%. Do we want to risk, and it depends who you are to determine how big a risk you think it is. Do we want to risk a contraction in supply at this time? Because we might see a big increase in households that are forced to leave that sector. I think rental reform is absolutely essential, but I'm just concerned that if we start fiddling around with it now, we could have a contraction in supply and make it worse for people.
Panel, other thoughts?
Well, look, I agree to a certain extent that it will have an impact on, I guess, private investors and their willingness to stay in that market and to hold that asset. I think, like the foreign buyer surcharge and other things that are there's enough there to discourage investors at the moment at a time when, as Stephen says, it's not a time to sort of make substantial changes, but I do think that there is a balance. I do think there are elements of reform that can happen and not have that impact. So I think it's just working out what that balance is.
Well, no grounds eviction is the sticking point. So are you saying the government should not do that? Make that illegal?
That's a REWA position. I don't have a fixed view either way. I think it's just really important that we do get the balance right. We don't go too hard one way or the other at this particular point in time.
If you look at the critical reforms,
you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, no grounds around maintenance, around pets and so forth. REWA would argue that every one of those would have a negative impact on investors. So I'm not quite sure what's left.
And as one of the largest landlords in the state, we would be reticent. We want to be careful around how we restructure the Tenancy Act.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Louise, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Loud voice, because I'm not sure where the microphone is.
This is a real sticking point, and we have a Make Renting Fair campaign. We don't agree with REWA, but we actually want to extend the list of what's the grounds for evictions to protect landlords and tenants. This is absolutely fundamental. And one of the lines we keep hearing is the housing will disappear. It's not like the movie Up. Not a bunch of balloons are going to take the houses away. The houses will still be there. People will either buy them to rent them out or get themselves off the rental market. This is absolutely fundamental at this time to do the tenancy reforms. Sorry, I disagree with many people on the panel, disagree with REWA, and there's many people who are part of the Make Renting Fair, including the unions, who are very supportive of the changes, and they're not huge. We have the second worst Tenancy Act in this country, and we've got to base it on evidence. They've done it in Melbourne and other states. It didn't see the fallout. We didn't see mum and dad investors pulling out of the market. So let's base the decision on evidence.
Louise, thank you. And thank you to everybody for your questions and taking part. And can we please thank our panel? To Natalie, Leon, Chris, Tanya and Stephen, thank you very much, and I'll get you to take your seats. We could talk about this issue for hours, couldn't we? Now, before you leave, I would like to ask Professor Vanessa Chang, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Business and Law at Curtin University, to deliver a vote of thanks. Please make her welcome.
To start by thanking Karen Jacobs for your insightful welcome to country. And I too like to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered here today belong to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. Now, today's report could not be more timely, and judging from what the panel has answered and the debate on the floor, I'd like to thank you all for coming today and thank all the speakers who have contributed to this event. To Peter Bouhlas, thank you for your opening remarks and insights from Bankwest Home Buying Division. Thank you to Professors Alan Duncan and Stephen Rowley for the engaging presentation of the report, which have many key findings. To our expert panel, Tanya Steinbeck, Chris Smith, Leon McIvor, and Natalie Sangalli, plus 3 speakers from the floor or panel members from the floor, thank you for your participation to the housing affordability and also with the challenges that we have faced this afternoon, which has generated real food for thought for all of us here. And Nadia, thank you for your expert facilitation, trying to look at where you are here. And really wonderful to have Nadia facilitating today's event and taking the questions from the floor as well. I'd like to also acknowledge the Bankwest leadership team in the room, led by the Bankwest Executive General Manager, Jason Chan. We could not be prouder of the partnership between Bankwest and Curtin and the vital work that the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre delivers, as you have seen here this afternoon. Thank you also to the Morley Senior High School economics students and the teachers here today. And as you have seen, that with events like this, we do want to give our younger generation the voice and to hear from them. I hope today have given you a taste of what's really important in housing affordability and for the high school student in economics as well. I'd like to wrap up with a few reflections of my own today. And as we all know, housing affordability is a crucial topic, and it is absolutely topical now everywhere. Housing is a major impediment in drawing more people into Western Australia. And this report, and you would agree with me, has sobering findings and challenging findings as well on increasing the levels of housing stress, whether people are in rental accommodation or mortgage property. Curtin University, like other universities, has a keen interest in supporting our state and building its population and skills base. In that respect, we very much support measures the state and federal government are looking to accelerate the supply of housing and addressing the issues of housing in Western Australia. We have heard the challenges, and yet they are tremendous opportunities as well to increase accommodation. And together, I think, with the room full of people here, we will be able to overcome shortages of accommodation. Our industry and economy, and you will agree with me, will only flourish as a result of workers, skilled migrant workers or people visiting us and making WA the choice of destination. So to conclude, thank you all for attending and supporting the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre. You can find more information on the centre or download a copy of the Housing Affordability Report today at bcec.edu.au. I hope you have enjoyed today's event, and thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much to Professor Vanessa Chang. Thank you all for coming and for your interest in this very important issue. I know you'll continue these conversations. We're going to be talking about this for some years yet. And as Vanessa said, go and check out the report. Take it with you, share it around and jump on the website. Thank you and enjoy your weekend.